The truth is simple. Kings did not chase mistresses for desire. They chased them because power was slowly killing them. Their palaces were full, yet their lives hollowed quietly beneath the weight of ritual and expectation. Each stolen encounter revealed fractures the crown refused to acknowledge. What they sought was never love, but a doorway out of themselves. Tonight, we step into the shadows where those hidden escapes were born. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly behind the velvet screens of a Tudor palace, one would find that power did not sound like triumph, but like an endless, echoing silence. The crown rested heavily on a man who was expected to feel everything: glory, certainty, divine purpose. Yet most days, he felt nothing at all. The ceremonies that once stirred his pride became motions performed by habit, gestures repeated because they were required, not because they meant anything. Courtiers bowed, choirs sung, and advisors whispered plans for the nation. But none of it seemed to touch him anymore. It was as if the world had thickened around him, muffling every sensation until even victory tasted dull. In that stillness, the king's days followed a rigid pattern: councils, signatures, audience, blessings, obligations. Every hour was spoken for long before it arrived. His private chambers, supposedly a refuge, felt more like another corridor lined with expectations. Even meals were part of the theatre. Every bite watched, every pause noted, every glance interpreted. He lived inside a role built centuries before he was born, wrapped in a destiny he could not shape, only perform. Over time, the distance between the man and the monarch widened, leaving a hollow space he did not know how to fill. The queen, bound to her own duties, moved through the palace with the discipline of someone raised for a life of representation. She was grace, order, continuity, an emblem more than a companion. Their conversations had become exchanges of politeness, careful and predictable. In her presence, he felt the weight of lineage pressing harder, reminding him that marriage was a structure, not a shelter. Whatever feelings he once hoped might grow there had been replaced by the cold precision of ritual. In the eyes of Europe, they were the image of stability. In reality, they lived parallel lives that rarely touched. It was within this quiet desolation that the idea of escape began to take shape, not as a rebellion, not even as desire, but as the smallest flicker of wanting to feel alive again. The court could not offer such a sensation. It was built to constrain, to polish, to maintain order at all costs. But beyond the formal gardens, beyond the measured footsteps of servants, there existed moments not yet assigned meaning. He longed for something uncalculated, something that did not bow to him, something that did not ask him to be a king. A mistress was not chosen for beauty alone. She represented a doorway into a space where the crown could not follow. In her presence, he did not need to uphold nations or dynasties. He could exist as a man without titles. Her youth was not simply youth. It was a reminder of sensations he had let slip away. Her laughter, untrained by court etiquette, sounded strange at first, then disarming. Her uncertainty, her curiosity, her unpolished manner created a kind of unscripted world he could step into for a little while. It was only there, in a borrowed room with no ceremony and no witnesses, that he discovered the faint outline of feeling returning. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself it was harmless. Yet the space she created, small, fragile, imperfect, felt more real than anything, waiting for him in the state chambers. While the court saw a king who commanded armies, he saw a man who had forgotten how to breathe. The mistress did not fix this truth, she only illuminated it. And once illuminated, the emptiness became impossible to ignore. In the palace halls, the king walked as though carved from authority, but behind closed doors, he lingered in the quiet moments that made him believe he could still sense warmth. The contradiction was undeniable. A man with absolute power, seeking refuge in the company of someone who possessed none. The world outside would have called it moral weakness, political carelessness, dangerous indulgence. Yet for him, it was the first time in years that emotion did not feel like a distant memory. He began returning to her, not out of passion alone, but out of exhaustion. Each visit peeled away a layer of silence, just enough to remind him he was still a human being beneath the layers of ceremony. And though he knew the escape could never last, he also knew he was unwilling to surrender it. The crown demanded his life. But for a few hours, he could borrow a different one. The king's emptiness had merely found something soft to lean on. If one were to compare this to the present day, it would resemble a leader quietly searching for a room where the world cannot reach him. I cannot help noticing how easily power creates loneliness deep enough for anyone to stumble toward the nearest warmth. To him, these moments were a quiet refuge carved out of a life built on duty. Somewhere beyond these walls, another presence was already waiting to reshape his sense of escape. And there was a sound, soft, uncertain, that many later claimed was the beginning of everything he tried not to feel. Age crept into the royal body long before anyone dared to mention it. The stiffness in the joints appeared first, to a quiet protest each morning, as he rose from the bed designed more for ceremony than rest. His breath shortened during hunts, his grip weakened during sword demonstrations, and the weight of armor felt heavier than ever. Yet the court expected him to move with the same force he displayed in youth. The kingdom depended on the illusion that its ruler was untouched by time, and so he forced himself to walk with the posture of a man who feared nothing. But in the privacy of his chambers, he felt the small betrayals of the flesh more clearly than any political threat. He watched younger courtiers pass through the halls with an ease he no longer possessed. Their laughter came readily. Their steps were light, their faces unmarked by responsibility. Nothing in their movements reminded them of mortality. Everything in his did. Their presence stirred an unease he tried to hide, a reminder of the man he once was, or the man he thought he would remain. Each time his gaze lingered on them, he confronted the distance between who he appeared to be and who he was becoming. That distance widened with every passing season. At banquets, he caught glimpses of himself, reflected in polished silver or the glassy shimmer of wine. The face staring back was heavier around the eyes, carved by years of decisions no one else could make for him. Grey appeared at the temples, then refused to retreat. His smile, when it came, felt practiced rather than spontaneous. There was no cruelty in these reflections, only honesty, and honesty was something he struggled to look at directly. In youth, the crown had amplified his presence. In age, it magnified his vulnerabilities. Dignitaries still praised his vigor, insisting he appeared strong as ever. These compliments, intended as reassurances, only deepened his discomfort. He knew they admired the facade, not the truth. He wondered whether they saw the tremor in his hand as he lifted a goblet, or the moment he paused at the foot of a staircase, gathering himself before climbing. He wondered how long he could sustain the image expected of him, and he feared the day the mask slipped, revealing not weakness but humanity. It was during these years of slow decline that the king began to turn his eyes toward youth, not his own, but the youth embodied by someone else. A mistress did not erase time, but she softened its blows. Her presence allowed him to step briefly outside the march of years, and into a space untouched by duty. When she smiled, he felt the echo of something forgotten. When she moved, he recalled the way his own body once responded to the world with ease. She was not merely a companion, she was a mirror reflecting a version of himself that no longer existed. Her vitality contrasted sharply with the rigidity of court life. She moved without caution, spoke without calculation, and touched him without the weight of expectation. These small freedoms unsettled him at first. They hinted at a life less burdened by roles and responsibilities. The court would have deemed such energy improper, yet he found in it a reminder of breath rather than obligation. Her youth did not mock his age. It revealed what he missed. And in longing for those lost parts, he leaned more heavily on her presence. He began to notice how her laughter lifted the dim corners of his private chambers. He noticed how she walked without the heaviness he carried, unburdened by memory. Her innocence was not naivete, but distance. Distance from the years that had shaped him, hardened him, hollowed him. When she looked at him, she did not see a figure worn by time. She saw a man still capable of being moved. That alone felt like an offering, and he accepted it greedily, even guiltily. Night after night, he returned to her, not simply to escape the court, but to escape the ticking of time within his own body. When he lay beside her, he felt momentarily suspended between who he had been and who he feared he was becoming. She allowed him to pretend that strength still flowed easily through him, that age had not stripped away the parts he valued most. And though he understood the illusion, he clung to it. It was better than the truth waiting outside the door. In the great halls, he still played the role expected of him. He still commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and delivered speeches with authority. But beneath the crown, he carried a growing awareness that time could not be dismissed with decrees. The mistress did not cure this fear. She distracted him from it. And distraction, for a man who had begun to feel every passing year like a tightening band, was a form of salvation. It is almost comical how a king could cling to scraps of youth while pretending to command the future. If one were to place this fear into a modern room, it would look like a leader hiding behind bright lights so no one notices the shaking in his hands. I cannot deny how human he seems when age touches him more sharply than any blade ever could. Age had weakened his certainty long before anyone dared whisper it. Somewhere deeper in his story, another figure was waiting to test the boundaries of what he feared losing. And there was a quiet moment, barely noticed, when the reflection he sought no longer matched the man returning his gaze. Royal marriages were arranged long before the bride and groom ever exchanged a single word. Agreements were drafted in distant chambers, where maps covered the walls and ambition guided every decision. The union was not a matter of companionship, but of borders, alliance, and bloodlines. By the time the vows were spoken, the shape of their lives had already been sealed by hands far removed from affection. The king understood this, yet understanding offered no comfort. Duty had chosen his wife, and duty had not bothered to ask what he desired. The queen entered the marriage with the same clarity. She was raised for diplomacy, moulded into a symbol meant to reassure foreign courts and reinforce domestic order. Her gestures were precise, her posture impeccable, her smile the product of years spent learning how to conceal personal thoughts behind a veil of royal composure. She did not expect tenderness, because tenderness had never been promised. Her role was continuity, and continuity required sacrifice. In this arrangement, feelings were not absent, they were simply irrelevant. Their shared life unfolded with quiet predictability. Mornings began with ritual, afternoons were filled with obligations, and evenings dissolved into the same carefully measured routines. They spoke often, yet rarely said anything that mattered. Their words hovered politely between them, never moving deep enough to stir connection. Affection did not grow in such soil, it withered before taking root. The palace celebrated them as a model of stability, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see the distance that defined their private world. There were moments when the king attempted to breach that distance. He would visit her chambers with the intention of speaking honestly, of confessing the fatigue that pressed on him, the loneliness that shadowed even his brightest days. But each time he opened his mouth, the weight of expectation silenced him. The queen, sitting with perfect composure, seemed both near and unreachable. Whatever vulnerability he wished to express felt out of place in a room built to uphold decorum, and so he remained silent, locking the truth inside himself. The queen, for her part, felt the same emptiness. She watched him move through the palace with the confidence required of his position. Yet she sensed the strain beneath the surface. She wanted to offer him something more than duty, some thread of comfort or shared understanding. But the structure of their marriage left no room for such gestures. Intimacy was permitted only when tied to political necessity, heirs, appearances, and expectations. Any deeper connection fell outside the boundaries prescribed for them. Years passed, and the small emotional gaps grew into a chasm neither of them dared to acknowledge. They lived beside each other rather than with each other. The palace, vast as it was, seemed too small to accommodate the space between their hearts. Servants moved quietly around them, recognizing the atmosphere but unable to alter it. They were a royal couple admired by nations, yet strangers within their own home. It was during this prolonged silence that the king's sense of yearning intensified. The marriage offered stability, but not solace. It protected the realm, but not his spirit. He began to feel as though he were performing a role in a play that repeated endlessly, with no intermission and no audience capable of seeing him beyond the costume. The crown bound him to the queen, but the bond lacked warmth. Together, they upheld a dynasty, alone. They carried the weight of unmet longing. In this void, the presence of another woman, someone unconnected to treaties and unburdened by ceremonial expectations, became increasingly difficult to resist. A mistress did not represent responsibility. She represented relief. Her existence illuminated the emptiness that had quietly expanded inside the royal marriage. She did not replace the queen, nor was she meant to. She simply filled a space the marriage had never even attempted to reach. He found himself thinking about her more often, not because he sought rebellion, but because he sought something real. The queen saw the shift before he admitted it to himself. She understood that affection, once neglected long enough, seeks its own escape routes. She did not blame him. She blamed the structure that shaped them both. A system that prized alliances over emotion would inevitably produce hearts trained to survive without tenderness. The palace whispered about loyalty and duty, but behind closed doors, the truth was quieter. Two people bound by crown and lineage, yet separated by a life they never truly chose. That separation became the silent rhythm of their days, guiding every decision that followed. It is almost bitterly funny how a kingdom could praise a marriage that starved both people living inside it. If one were to compare these unions to modern times, they would resemble partnerships built entirely for appearances, with affection treated as an unnecessary luxury. I can't help noticing how the absence of choice leaves marks deeper than any public duty ever could. Their union offered stability to the realm, but little comfort to their private selves. Some were waiting in the shadows of their obligations. A different kind of connection was preparing to emerge. There was a moment, small, unspoken, when both understood the silence between them had already chosen the direction of their lives. The queen entered the palace, not as a woman, but as an emblem fashioned by generations before her. Everything about her life, from the color of her gowns to the way she held her hands during ceremonies, was designed to communicate order. She stood for lineage, continuity, and the unbroken thread of monarchy. People bowed to her not because they knew her, but because she represented a structure older than any living soul in the kingdom, even within her private chambers. The weight of symbolism hovered like a permanent guest. She was never merely herself. She was always the crown's reflection. Her days unfolded according to protocol, each moment dictated by rules that allowed almost no room for spontaneity. The court admired her discipline, mistaking it for serenity. They saw her steady posture and interpreted it as confidence, unaware that it was simply the only way she had learned to exist. She moved through the palace like someone navigating the inside of a glass case, visible to all, touched by none. Every word she spoke, every gesture she offered, had to be controlled so that no hint of personal emotion slipped free. Emotion was unpredictable, and unpredictability had no place in the life of a queen. The king approached her with the same restraint. Their relationship, formed for the sake of alliances, bore none of the warmth that might have anchored them to each other. At first, he tried to understand her silence, believing it to be shyness. But in time, he recognized it as the silence of someone taught to survive by withholding. Their closeness was not a matter of affection, it was an obligation, performed according to expectations woven into the fabric of royal life. The bed they shared belonged more to the dynasty than to either of them. Nights spent together became rituals rather than encounters. Servants prepared the room with solemn precision, as though arranging an altar. The queen would sit near the bed, her expression composed, her breathing steady, waiting for the king to join her. She never complained. She never asked for tenderness. She merely fulfilled what was required, believing that duty was the strongest form of devotion she could offer. But devotion given without the possibility of refusal is not devotion, it is surrender. And surrender, repeated over the years, quietly hollows a person from the inside. The king sensed this hollowness without fully grasping its depth. Her calmness looked cold from a distance. Her precision felt like distance, even when she stood only inches away. He learned to speak to her in the same careful tones she used with him, as though the two of them were performing parallel roles in a play that had lost its audience long ago. Their marriage did not resemble companionship, it resembled governance. Every interaction affirmed the palace's expectations, not their own desires. Still, the queen tried to offer something more than formality. In rare moments when no servants lingered by the doors, she attempted small gestures, asking about his hunts, his counsels, his restless nights. But these gestures, though sincere, were fragile compared to the vast machinery of tradition. He answered politely, feeling guilty that he could not reach back. There was a wall between them, built not from animosity, but from centuries of royal precedent. As years passed, her identity fused so tightly with the symbolic role that she could barely distinguish where the queen ended and the woman began. She carried herself with dignity, but beneath that surface lived a loneliness almost too quiet to name. She longed for a life where she could laugh without rehearsing the sound, speak without fearing misinterpretation, or even walk without a trail of watchers. But such longings found no place in her world. She suppressed them as she had been taught, believing suppression to be a form of strength. Slowly, the king's perception of her shifted. Instead of seeing a partner, he saw a monument, beautiful, immovable, and distant. A monument cannot return affection. It can only endure. He began to avoid the spaces where such endurance felt most painful. He spent more time in hunting lodges, private libraries, and shadowed corridors where he could breathe without feeling observed. The queen noticed his absences, but she interpreted them as necessities of kingship rather than withdrawals from her. She never allowed herself to assume he sought comfort elsewhere. Her faithfulness to duty blinded her to the natural cracks forming between them. In this widening silence, the presence of a mistress became not a scandal, but an inevitability. The queen, bound in roles that demanded perfection, could not compete with the freedom another woman offered. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not seek confrontation. She simply continued performing her appointed part, while the king drifted toward places where he could exist without the burden of representation. The palace watched this quiet divergence with the same passivity it reserved for eclipses, unavoidable, predictable, and beyond intervention. By then, the queen's life had become a tapestry of obligations, stitched so tightly that no thread could be loosened. She remained dignified, steadfast, unyielding. But her steadiness came at the cost of invisibility. She embodied stability for the kingdom, yet found none within herself. In her silence lay the truth that the realm refused to acknowledge. A symbol cannot be a lover, and a crown cannot cradle a heart. It is almost tragic how the queen's perfection served everyone except herself. If one were to place her role into a modern world, it would resemble someone praised endlessly for strength, while quietly carrying a life stripped of softness. I cannot ignore the way her composure hides a loneliness carved slowly, year after year. By duty, her presence anchored the court, even as it emptied her private world. Deeper in that emptiness, another figure waited to reshape the king's sense of connection. Some whispered that the first shift in his gaze began long before anyone understood what it meant. The king first noticed the peculiar comfort of anonymity when he stepped into a room where no one bowed too deeply. No one measured his footsteps, and no one strained to interpret the slightest shift in his expression. It was a small room, poorly lit, with a faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the corners. But inside it he felt something he had forgotten existed, the absence of expectation. For a man accustomed to living beneath layers of ceremony, this absence felt almost disorienting. Here, he was not a monarch sculpted by duty. He was merely a person taking up space. The mistress did not greet him with the precision of the court. Her curtsy was imperfect, her speech unpolished, her gestures unconcerned with protocol. Yet it was precisely this lack of refinement that unsettled him most unexpectedly. She looked at him without calculating how her gaze might affect her future. She listened to him without worrying which advisor would analyze her silence. Her presence was not a reflection of political necessity. It was simply present. He had not realized how starved he was for such simplicity. For the king, the allure was never about beauty alone. The court was filled with beauty, sculpted, polished, arranged like ornaments designed to impress foreign envoys. But beauty within the palace was a performance. It demanded perfection, consistency, and careful presentation. With the mistress, beauty took on a different shape, one made of imperfection and immediacy. When she smiled, it was without restraint. When she frowned, she did not disguise it. Her emotions moved freely across her face, and he found himself drawn to that freedom more than to her features. In her company, the king experienced moments unclaimed by state matters. For a few hours, he could set aside the weight of treaties, rebellion, and the endless pressure to appear infallible. She treated him as if he were a man who could be questioned, teased, or contradicted without consequence. No one in the palace dared to do such things. They feared missteps, punishments, shifts in favor. The mistress feared none of that. She feared only losing the small connection they had built, and that fear made her honest in ways the court could never be. He found relief in being spoken to casually, even clumsily. The palace valued eloquence to the point of suffocation. Every statement was a performance, every silence a political tool. But with her, conversation wandered without purpose. She asked him about things no one else dared to ask: what he liked to eat, what songs he remembered from childhood, and whether he ever wished to be somewhere quiet. These questions did not advance political agendas, yet they reached parts of him long ignored. Over time, he discovered that what he cherished was not admiration, but normalcy. To be touched not as a monarch, but as a man. to breathe without being observed, to laugh without it becoming a matter of gossip. The palace demanded that he exist as an idea rather than a person. The mistress allowed him to exist as both, though she expected nothing in return. Her room became a narrow pocket of the world, where he could shed layers of identity like heavy garments left at the door. There was a particular night he remembered vividly. He arrived exhausted after a day of negotiations that drained even the illusion of control he tried to maintain. When she opened the door, she did not bow. She simply stepped aside, letting him enter a silence untainted by expectation. She did not ask about the council or the treaties. Instead, she asked whether he wanted to sit or lie down. The question was so ordinary that it nearly broke him. The kind of question no one had asked him in years. Simply being offered a choice unconnected to governance felt like an unexpected gift. In those stolen hours, forgetting became a luxury. Forgetting he was king. Forgetting he was aging. Forgetting that he lived inside an institution that demanded constant performance. With her, he let memory pause. He let thoughts soften. He allowed himself to feel things that made no demands and carried no consequences. This forgetting was not escapism born of weakness. It was survival. A quiet rebellion against a life that left no room for vulnerability. Yet he understood, even in the softest moments, that such refuge was fragile. The palace would never accept this simplicity, nor could it survive exposure to the political winds that surrounded him daily. A mistress could offer comfort, but not permanence. Still, fragility did not lessen the relief he found. It intensified it. Knowing the escape was temporary made each moment sharper, more vivid, more achingly real. What unsettled him most was not the depth of feeling, but the recognition that he depended on these moments more than he had intended. He returned to her not out of indulgence but out of necessity. She offered him something no council, no ritual, no royal decree ever could. The chance to forget he was trapped inside the very life he had been raised to inherit. It is almost absurd how a man commanding nations sought solace in the simplicity of being spoken to without fear. If this were placed in a modern setting, it would resemble a leader escaping into a quiet cafe just to remember what it feels like to be ordinary. I cannot help noticing how the desire to be unburdened reveals truths even crowns cannot conceal. For him, forgetting became the rarest form of comfort. Somewhere beyond that comfort, another shift in loyalty was quietly forming. Even the smallest moment of ease carried the seed of choices he could not yet see. Youth entered the king's life, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, startling force of contrast. He had spent decades surrounded by people trained to hide emotion, to speak cautiously, to tread carefully around his moods. Then came a young mistress whose presence ignored these conventions entirely. She carried herself with a brightness untouched by the weight of governance, and that brightness unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. Her steps were quick, uncalculated, her reactions unfiltered, her curiosity unrestrained. For a man accustomed to caution, her energy felt like a sudden breath of air in a room long sealed shut. She brought with her the vitality of someone who still believed the world could change shape around her desires. He observed this with something close to longing. Her laughter rose easily, not because she sought to please him, but because the world still surprised her. The king had forgotten what surprise felt like. In her, he saw a version of life before crowns, before councils, before choices made decades earlier continued to rule every hour of his present. Youth did not remind him of what he had, it reminded him of what time had quietly taken. Her admiration held a power he did not expect. It was not strategic, not crafted for political gain, not wrapped in flattery that hid ulterior motives. She admired him simply because she believed the stories told about kings were true. She saw him through unweathered eyes, as someone remarkable, someone strong, someone capable of shaping the world. That belief, naive as it was, reached him more deeply than the careful praise of seasoned diplomats. For her, He was extraordinary. For the palace, he was merely expected. In her presence, he sensed something he had not felt in years: relevance. The court respected him because they were required to. The mistress admired him because she chose to. That distinction mattered more than he admitted. He found himself seeking that gaze of hers, the one that held awe without fear, curiosity without calculation. She made him feel as though age had not confiscated every part of him worth noticing. Her youth did not diminish him. It illuminated the parts of himself he believed had grown dim. There were moments when he watched her move around the small room they shared. She reached for objects without hesitation, touched his arm without ceremonious restraint, and asked questions without rehearsing politeness. Each action reminded him of the difference between a life shaped by court etiquette and a life shaped by instinct. She embodied the beginning of things. Freshness, possibility, the sensation of stepping into unknown territory. He had not felt that kind of beginning in years. Every decision he made as king was calculated, bound by consequences stretching far beyond himself. But with her, nothing was predetermined. She also carried the unapologetic confidence of someone whose future still felt expandable. She spoke of dreams with a looseness that startled him. She imagined days beyond the present with a boldness he had long abandoned. Listening to her made him confront the ways time had narrowed his world. The kingdom demanded stability. Youth demanded freedom. He had grown so accustomed to duty that he barely recognized the hunger she stirred, a desire to reclaim the feeling of life unfolding rather than closing in. The king did not envy her youth. He envied the way youth allowed her to move through the world without invisible weights. Her emotions were not yet scarred by loss or hardened by responsibility. When she smiled at him, the smile carried no political meaning, no diplomatic signal, only warmth. That warmth seeped into him slowly, reminding him that age had not extinguished his capacity to respond. He began to understand that youth itself was a form of power, subtle, unspoken, and strangely potent. It did not command armies or sign decrees. Yet it could alter the posture of a king. It could soften a hardened gaze, loosen a clenched jaw, pull a weary man back toward the memory of who he once imagined he could be. Her presence did not diminish him. It revived him. She made him feel not younger, but less forgotten by himself. There was a softness in the way she leaned toward him when he spoke, as though every word he offered mattered. Her attention was not crafted like a courtier's, but genuine, unstudied. In that attention, he rediscovered a sense of beginning, a quiet, trembling sense that life still held new corners he had not explored. Her questions, her naivety, her wholehearted reactions reminded him of the first years of his reign when everything felt possible. He had not tasted that sensation in decades. Yet beneath the comfort, a delicate tension lingered. Youth carries its own dangers. It can make the old believe they have stepped outside the reach of time. It can trick a king into feeling invulnerable. It can create dependence disguised as affection. He recognized these risks. But recognition did not sever his attachment. He returned to her again and again because her presence made him feel less like a relic and more like a man still capable of renewal. She did not know how much he needed her energy to soften the slow erosion of age. She did not see the way he paused before entering her chambers, gathering himself not as a king, but as someone hoping to feel something uncomplicated. To her, he was a figure of authority who chose to spend his evenings in her company. To him, she was a quiet rebellion against the fading of his own vitality. It is almost amusing how youth, without trying, can sway a ruler more effectively than any council ever could. If one were to translate this dynamic into the present, it would resemble an older leader, gravitating toward anyone who reminds him that time has not entirely claimed him. I cannot ignore the way her presence revealed how deeply he feared becoming invisible within his own life. Her vitality revived a part of him that had long gone quiet. Another shift in their fragile balance was already forming in the shadows of that newfound energy. Rumour later claimed that the first sign was the way he began lingering at her door, reluctant to return to the life waiting beyond it. Life inside the palace followed a rhythm so rigid that even the passing of the seasons felt muted behind its stone walls. The same corridors echoed with the same footsteps. The same voices recited the same formalities. Days blended into one another until time itself seemed to lose its texture. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every word filtered through caution. Every expression measured for political weight. The king lived inside this structured stillness for so long that he stopped noticing how thoroughly it had numbed him. The palace preserved him, but it also imprisoned him in repetition. Then came the mistress, and with her came a kind of novelty the palace had no defences against. She brought stories from streets he no longer remembered. Tales of vendors arguing over fruit prices. Children running between market stalls. Neighbours gossiping loudly with no fear of consequence. These stories carried a rawness, a looseness, a softness the palace lacked entirely. Her words filled the air with textures that clung to him long after she finished speaking. For a king who lived surrounded by silence, disguised as order. Her voice sounded like movement. She also carried attitudes that startled him. She questioned his statements without trembling. She laughed at moments no courtier would dare to find amusing. She reacted to emotions as they arose rather than locking them behind ritual. The king found himself both unsettled and drawn to this spontaneity. It reminded him of a world where he existed as a participant rather than an icon. Her presence disrupted the palace precisely because she lived without its weight. The novelty she introduced did not come from grand gestures. It came from the smallest, most ordinary details. She entered a room without waiting for permission. She sat without positioning herself according to hierarchy. She interrupted herself mid-sentence because she remembered something unrelated. These actions, trivial in any other setting, felt radical inside the palace. They created moments that broke the monotony he had carried like a second skin. In her company, life regained shape. The king noticed changes within himself as well. He found himself anticipating her stories. The way she described the smell of rain on cobblestones. The taste of warm bread from a vendor who never bowed to anyone. The squabble she overheard between two women arguing about nothing and everything. He listened not because the stories held political significance, but because they held life. They reminded him that the world outside the palace did not move according to ceremony. He began to realize how starved he was for difference. The palace preserved continuity by suppressing variation. Novelty had been treated as a threat. But novelty, when it arrived in the shape of a young woman untrained in courtly behavior, offered him something he had forgotten to crave: unpredictability. He had grown so accustomed to knowing exactly what each hour required that he no longer remembered what it felt like to be surprised. She brought back that sensation with every unfiltered breath. Her reactions to the palace itself fascinated him. She looked at the tapestries he had seen since childhood and found them overwhelming. She touched the polished furniture as if it were fragile. She stepped onto the balcony and gasped at the view he considered ordinary. Through her eyes, the palace appeared strange again. Grand. Intimidating. Excessive. Her awe became his reminder of what the building once meant before it hardened into routine. It was both amusing and humbling to rediscover the world he lived in through someone untouched by its suffocating expectations. Even the way she moved felt different. Courtiers glided, controlled, and quiet. Weighing every step, she walked with uneven eagerness, her skirts brushing against furniture instead of avoiding it. She approached him without the calculations he sensed in every advisor's gesture. There was no strategy in her nearness. There was simply nearness. For a man surrounded by people who acted according to what they hoped to gain, her lack of agenda shook him. At times, he caught himself studying her as though she were a reminder of a world he had been forced to abandon. She represented the possibility that life could still shift, even within a palace that seemed frozen in expectation. She disrupted his certainty in ways both gentle and piercing. With her, he felt the subtle tremors of change. This novelty did not threaten his authority, it threatened his numbness. And numbness, once disturbed, reveals needs long buried. The king found himself wanting more moments like these. Moments where life did not feel predetermined. The mistress did not intend to reshape his world. She merely occupied it with authenticity. But authenticity, in a space built on formality, becomes a force that alters everything around it. He began lingering in her chambers longer than he intended, unwilling to return to the predictable quiet of his royal rooms. Her presence softened the edges of the day. Her questions pulled him into conversations he did not know he longed for. Her laughter cracked open spaces he had sealed for years. Novelty became not a distraction but a relief. Yet the palace noticed the shift long before he admitted it to himself. Servants exchanged glances. Advisors questioned the new delays in his schedule. The queen observed him with calm, resigned understanding. Novelty, even in its gentlest form, always leaves traces. And in a world where sameness maintained stability, difference became its own kind of rebellion. It is almost ironic how the smallest disruptions can shake a palace more effectively than political storms. If placed in a modern world, this would resemble someone trapped in routine, suddenly drawn to a presence that reminds them they are still alive. I cannot ignore the way Novelty revealed how deeply he longed for something that did not feel predetermined. Her presence shifted his inner world long before anyone noticed the outward change. Somewhere in that shift, another stir of emotion began forming beneath his caution. Whispers later claimed the true turning point was the moment he realized he dreaded the silence more than the scandal. The king had grown accustomed to speaking into rooms where every word was measured, weighed, and stored away for later use. In the council chamber, his statements became directives. In the throne hall, his sentences turned into proclamations. Even in private meetings, his smallest remarks could ripple outward and reshape the attitudes of entire factions. Everything he said carried consequence. And everyone who listened carried that consequence like a tool. Over time, he learned to speak less, to reveal less, to offer only the pieces of himself that could not be turned against him. So, when he found himself alone with the mistress, he did not expect the silence to feel different. Her quiet was not the quiet of strategy or deference. It lacked calculation. It did not anticipate an advantage. Her silence did not attempt to mold him into a more agreeable man. Nor did it wait for an opportunity to exploit his vulnerability. She simply listened. Or rather, she allowed him space to exist without interpretation. For a king trapped in centuries of ceremony, that simple allowance felt strangely revolutionary. She did not represent law or lineage or the expectations of the court. She held no authority that could bind him, no obligation he was required to honor, no political interest she needed to defend. Her presence was not a mirror reflecting power, but a space untouched by it. When he spoke, she did not nod with excessive respect or react with careful neutrality. She listened as though listening were enough. This absence of judgment, this rare quality of hearing without consequence, drew more truth from him than any advisor ever had. At first, he tested this silence cautiously. He mentioned frustrations so mild they barely counted as confessions. His weariness after long councils, his irritation with ceremonial duties, the pressure of endless scrutiny. She absorbed these words without attempting to resolve them. She offered neither rebuttal nor reassurance. She simply received them. The stillness between them softened, becoming less the silence of distance and more the silence of shared presence. Eventually, he allowed himself to speak of deeper concerns. He mentioned doubts about his own decisions, moments when he questioned whether he was guiding the kingdom or merely maintaining the illusion of control. These were thoughts he could never voice to the queen. Her life was structured around the stability that such doubts would undermine. Advisors, too, were impossible. Their loyalty was tied to ambition, and ambition made confession dangerous. But the mistress existed outside this political latticework. Her connection to him was not threaded with dependency or aspiration, and so his truth could rest safely with her. Sometimes she remained absolutely still while he spoke, her head tilted slightly, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Other times, she reacted with small gestures, a furrowed brow, a faint tightening of her lips, that signaled understanding without intrusion. She did not pretend to solve the dilemmas he carried. She did not disguise ignorance with false wisdom. She did not elevate herself by pretending to know more about ruling than he did. Her silence was not empty, it was deliberate. A kind of gentleness the palace had never shown him. There was a night when he realized that he had begun speaking to her, the way he once spoke to himself before age and responsibility hardened his inner voice. Words flowed easily, uncensored, released from the pressure to remain pristine. He admitted fears he had buried beneath years of authority, the fear of failing his people, the fear of becoming irrelevant, the fear that he no longer recognized the man he was expected to be. In her presence, these fears did not feel shameful. They felt human. She listened to him, as though listening was a form of acceptance. Her silence became a refuge, a space where he could unravel without collapsing. For the first time in decades, he experienced what it was like to not be recorded by history with every utterance. His advisors remembered everything. His court remembered selectively. His enemies remembered strategically. She remembered only what he needed her to. And often, that meant remembering nothing at all. He found himself returning to her, not for affection alone, but for the freedom to speak and then let go. With her, words evaporated instead of solidifying into political consequence. This evaporation became its own form of relief. There is a particular kind of comfort in knowing that one can speak without being preserved, that one can exist without being historical. The king, trapped in a role built upon memory and expectation, discovered that forgetting could be as powerful as attention. In the larger palace, his voice shaped nations. In her small, dimly lit chamber, his voice shaped nothing, and that was precisely what soothed him. Her silence did not diminish him. It released him from the weight of being unendingly significant. He came to understand that the absence of judgment was not weakness. It was its own kind of strength, subtle and rare, a quality that allowed him to inhabit himself rather than the crown. It is almost darkly humorous how the man commanding an entire realm needed a quiet room simply to feel heard. If placed in the present day, this would resemble someone powerful, seeking a conversation where their words do not automatically become instructions. I cannot escape the realization that the freedom he found in her silence revealed how burdened he had become by his own voice. Her listening created a sanctuary no palace hall could imitate. Somewhere inside that sanctuary, a shift was already forming in what the king believed he needed. Those close to the throne later whispered that the first sign appeared in how slowly he rose to leave her room. The king's days unfolded with a precision that left no corner of time untouched. Hours were allocated to councils, audience, rituals, and appearances long before morning light reached the palace windows. Every movement he made, where he sat, how he stood, the angle of his gaze, was part of a performance crafted to uphold the dignity of the crown. Even his breaths felt scheduled, as though the rhythm of his lungs needed to conform to the expectations of an entire kingdom. He lived inside a structure so unforgiving that spontaneity disappeared the moment it tried to surface. Yet, in a world built entirely around order, he found himself longing for disorder. Not chaos, but the simple absence of planning. He imagined a space with no waiting guards, no advisors hovering behind the door, no servants timing their steps according to the etiquette manuals written generations before them. A place where no one cared whether he wore the right expression or delivered the correct greeting. A room without symmetry, without scrutiny. without the suffocating echoes of responsibility. The longing began as a quiet ache and eventually settled into something more urgent. The mistress offered exactly that kind of room. It was small, slightly uneven in its construction, poorly lit, and utterly ordinary. There were moments when dust lingered in the corners, or when the fire burned too low. But these imperfections brought him more comfort than any of the palace's polished marble surfaces. In her chamber, time did not divide itself into tasks. It simply existed. He could sit on the edge of her bed without announcing his intention. He could rest his head in his hands without being asked whether he was unwell. He could breathe without being observed. Most striking of all, he did not need to perform. The crown did not enter the room with him. Not because he removed it physically, but because she did not treat him as someone wearing one. She spoke to him plainly, sometimes clumsily, often without the calculated pauses that filled courtly conversation, and he responded in the same manner, surprised at how quickly his formal tone dissolved when not required. The freedom felt so unfamiliar at first that he mistook it for discomfort. Only later did he recognize it as relief. He discovered that the absence of ceremony produced a different version of himself, without ritual dictating his posture. He slouched, without etiquette shaping his words. He hesitated, without observers recording his behavior. He allowed small vulnerabilities to surface: fatigue, doubt, and restlessness. These were parts of himself he rarely acknowledged, let alone expressed. In her presence, they flowed more easily, not because she demanded them, but because she created no barrier against them. Sometimes he arrived at her room without speaking at all. He would close the door quietly, sit by the window, and let silence stretch between them. She did not press him for conversation. She understood that silence could be a form of healing. The palace offered him no such option. Its silence was heavy, watchful, ready to pounce the moment he made a misstep. Her silence, by contrast, of a soft. It made space rather than pressure. In that space, he felt briefly suspended. No future weighing on him, no past chasing him, no expectations clinging to his actions. He also noticed how different time felt inside that unstructured room. Minutes did not rush or drag, they simply passed. Unnoticed, he found himself losing track of them entirely. Something unimaginable in the rest of his life. Advisors constantly reminded him of schedules. Servants monitored the hour with obsessive discipline. Even the queen lived according to a rigid framework that served the monarchy. But the mistress existed outside this framework. In her company, he experienced the rare luxury of presence, of being in a moment without anticipating the next. There were evenings when he lingered longer than intended, reluctant to return to the corridors that demanded his authority. He knew he could not remain indefinitely. Duty would always reclaim him. But the difficulty of leaving grew each time. The room felt like a sanctuary carved out of the world's expectations, fragile yet powerful enough to hold him still. When he closed the door behind him, the weight of kingship rushed back instantly, reminding him that sanctuary was temporary by design. The king understood the danger of becoming dependent on such refuge. A ruler who seeks too much escape risks losing sight of his responsibilities. Yet he could not deny that these moments of private existence made him more capable of facing the relentless structure outside. In forgetting his role for a brief time, he found the strength to return to it. The palace demanded discipline, but the mistress offered restoration. She did not plan to reshape his world. She merely provided a door into a quieter one, a world where he could pause without explanation, a world where he did not need to justify his exhaustion, a world where he was allowed to be unfinished rather than flawless. For a man carved into a symbol, this permission felt dangerously precious. It is almost ironic how a king surrounded by endless rooms sought refuge in the smallest one. If placed today, it would resemble someone powerful, slipping away to a forgotten corner just to breathe without being observed. I cannot help seeing how the absence of structure revealed more of him than the crown ever could. That small room held what none of the palace halls could offer. Somewhere inside that stillness, the balance between duty and desire began to tilt. Many later whispered that the true shift occurred the night he hesitated at the door. Unable to decide which world he belonged to, burden settled upon the royal marriage long before husband and wife ever learned the sound of each other's footsteps. It was a quiet but immovable weight, inherited not through choice, but through centuries of expectation. Every monarch was required to secure the future, and securing the future meant producing an heir, not simply a child, an heir, one who could continue the line, preserve alliances, and keep the kingdom from fracturing. The Queen's purpose, however gently it was phrased, revolved around this single obligation. Her life was shaped by a duty she had not chosen yet, could never refuse. Nothing about their intimacy resembled private affection. Servants prepared the Queen's chambers with ceremonial precision, adjusting curtains, arranging linens, and lighting candles as though performing a sacred ritual. The couple's closeness was transformed into a royal function, stripped of softness and filled instead with the silent pressure of expectation. The Queen carried this weight with trained composure, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. She understood that her body had become part of the state's machinery, her significance measured by the cradle that had yet to be filled. The king approached her with a heaviness that matched her own. His steps through the corridor echoed with a responsibility that overshadowed desire. He knew the court watched their marriage with relentless interest. Advisors analyzed the Queen's health. Courtiers whispered about omens and timing. Priests prayed loudly, as if divine intervention could be summoned by force. Each night he visited her chambers. He felt less like a man seeking a companion, and more like a monarch fulfilling a requirement. Their interactions unfolded with the formality of treaty negotiations. Conversation felt stiff, shaped by the knowledge that every word, every gesture, every shared breath was part of a process meant to secure the kingdom's future. Failure to conceive was not treated as a misfortune, it was treated as a deficiency. Neither of them said this aloud, but both felt the unspoken accusations seep into the spaces between them. Months without success deepened the strain. The Queen noticed glances that lingered too long, whispers that fell silent when she entered a room. Her value, in the eyes of the court, shrank each time hope faded. She concealed her sorrow beneath layers of royal discipline. But in private moments, she felt the sharp edge of inadequacy press against her heart. She wanted to offer the king what the kingdom demanded, yet her body remained beyond the reach of duty's commands. He watched her struggle, though she tried to hide it. A quiet guilt settled inside him, not because she had failed, but because he could not shield her from expectations imposed by traditions older than their marriage. Still, guilt did not dissolve the pressure. He knew the same weight pressed upon him as well. Without an heir, the stability of his reign would always be questioned. Without a son, the future of the dynasty remained uncertain. It was in this environment of suffocating expectation that the mistress's role became sharply contrasted. She lived outside the web of dynastic responsibility. No one demanded children from her. No council evaluated her health. Her worth was not tied to fertility, and her relationship with the king carried no political agenda. Their closeness, however flawed, existed free from the kingdom's gaze. When he stepped into her room, he crossed into a space untouched by expectation. Intimacy was not tied to obligation, it was tied to emotion. The absence of pressure made those moments deceptively soothing. He did not need to consider lineage when he held her. He did not need to measure the consequences of tenderness. She did not carry the kingdom's hopes on her shoulders. She carried only herself. And for a man drowning beneath duty, that difference mattered more than he dared admit. The Queen sensed the shift long before anyone voiced suspicion. She noticed how the king returned to her chambers with an exhaustion he could not disguise. She noticed the quiet hesitation before he spoke. She understood that intimacy devoid of affection could not sustain itself indefinitely. Her pain, however deep, remained contained behind the same composure she had worn since entering the palace. She was a queen. Queens endured. Still, endurance did not erase the loneliness creeping into their marriage. Each unsuccessful month widened the distance between them. Their shared life became a performance of duty without the heartbeat of mutual comfort. The king respected her deeply, but respect could not soften a structure built entirely on expectation, and expectation had already begun to erode whatever closeness they might have found. As the pressure intensified, he found himself clinging more tightly to the refuge offered by the mistress, not because she replaced the queen, but because she replaced the weight the queen represented. With her, he could forget lineage, if only for a moment. In a life defined by responsibility, forgetting became its own form of salvation. It is almost cruel how a dynasty's demands can turn human closeness into a public obligation. If mirrored in a modern world, it would look like two people forced into intimacy while an entire institution waits for results. I cannot ignore how the Queen's quiet endurance revealed a depth of strength the palace rarely acknowledged. Their marriage served the kingdom, but starved their hearts. Somewhere in that widening emptiness, the king's dependence on private refuge deepened in ways he could no longer deny. Rumour later claimed the true fracture appeared the night she realized he feared failure more than he feared losing her. Emotional territory surrounding the king rarely allowed him the freedom to explore what he felt. Every expression, every hesitation, every flicker of doubt carried political meaning inside the palace walls. His voice belonged to the council. His composure belonged to the court. And even his silence belonged to the expectations of those who waited for him to embody certainty. Yet beneath the layers of authority lay a man who had never been permitted to experience the full range of his emotions without consequence. Power demanded control, and control demanded restraint. A mistress changed that landscape. She existed outside the rigid system that shaped the queen. The court, and the kingdom itself. Her presence offered him something the palace could not, a private arena where emotions could appear without being weighed, interpreted, or weaponized. In her company, feelings became experiments, moments he could enter and exit without altering the architecture of his reign. He discovered that affection came easily there. It did not need to be justified. Sentiment did not require permanence. He could feel warmth one night and indifference the next, without fear of scandal or rumour. The fluidity of their bond allowed him to drift through emotional states freely, unbound by obligation or expectation. No advisor tracked his moods. No priest reminded him of duty. No lineage depended on what happened between them. In a life otherwise defined by permanence, such impermanence felt strangely liberating. At times, he found himself leaning into tenderness. Not because he loved deeply, but because the softness felt unfamiliar, and therefore intoxicating. The mistress responded with equal fluidity. She knew her place in the world and understood that emotional shifts were not threats, but conditions of their arrangement. She had learned to hold affection lightly, for her survival depended on it. In her world, feelings were currencies meant to be spent, not saved. Other nights, he arrived at her room carrying frustration rather than longing. He spoke with unusual openness, releasing thoughts he would never dare express in the presence of the queen or council. His mistress listened without judgment, offering no solutions, allowing the emotion itself to exist. He found comfort in that unfiltered space. Even if the emotion dissolved quickly afterward, she understood that emotional release, not emotional depth, was often what he sought. There were moments when he grew irritated, even bored, and she recognized that too. Their connection did not require consistency. Intensity could fade, and no one beyond that room would notice. Affection could shift into distance without consequence. He could retreat when he wished, return when he felt drawn, and her role would adjust with the tides of his moods. In the palace, such volatility would have caused chaos. With her, it simply passed. He realized he treated their relationship like a quiet rehearsal for emotions he could never display publicly. Desire, frustration, disappointment, curiosity. Each emotion entered the room like an uninvited guest, and rather than pushing it away, he allowed it to stay. The mistress learned these patterns quickly. She adapted with the skill of someone who had spent her life navigating the unpredictable desires of powerful men. Her survival depended on her ability to read emotions as they surfaced, and she did so with an unsettling accuracy. This imbalance, his freedom to feel, her need to absorb, created a dynamic that rested on silent truths. He could withdraw affection suddenly. She could not. He could turn cold without risking his position. She could not. Their emotional exchanges were not equal, yet both understood the terms without speaking them aloud. He sought expression. She provided space. It was a transaction wrapped in sentiment, never pretending to be more than it was. What surprised him most was how temporary each feeling became. In the palace, emotions were expected to last. Joy, sorrow, anger, grief. All of them carried political implications when expressed by a king. With the mistress, they evaporated quickly, leaving no trace. The lack of permanence became its own form of relief. He could enter her room heavy with emotion and leave weightless, knowing nothing lingered that could threaten his reign. But this freedom also carried a subtle danger. He grew accustomed to the ease with which he could cast emotions aside. Feelings became consumable. Connections became disposable. The mistress's presence enabled him to explore the softer and darker corners of himself without accountability. What he learned about his own heart in that room often evaporated the moment he returned to the palace halls. He became someone who felt deeply, but briefly, intensely, but without roots. It is unsettling how easily power can turn emotion into a passing indulgence, rather than a shared truth. If compared to modern life, it resembles someone practicing different versions of themselves with people who are never meant to stay. I cannot ignore how the mistress absorbed each feeling with the quiet acceptance of someone who knew none of it was truly hers. Their closeness offered freedom, but not clarity. Somewhere in that shifting space, the king began to mistake indulgence for understanding. Whispers later suggested that the real transformation occurred when he realized how quickly he could discard a feeling once it had served its purpose. Control shaped every corner of the king's world. It defined his mornings, dictated his decisions, and followed him through the polished corridors like a silent companion. Yet even with all the authority he carried, there were regions of his life where power felt strangely fragile. Governance, diplomacy, succession. Each demanded precision, negotiation, and the constant risk of failure. Control in those realms was never absolute. It wavered with circumstance, with alliances, with fate. But in one place, one relationship, its boundaries did not blur. A mistress lived inside that space. Her existence was tied entirely to his will. The privileges she enjoyed, the rooms she occupied, the clothes she wore, the protection she received. None were guaranteed beyond his continued interest. She understood this instinctively. The imbalance between them was not hidden. It was the very foundation of their bond. He held the power to elevate her or to erase her with nothing more than a decision whispered in private. For him, this certainty created a sense of stability no council or army could provide. The king found comfort in the predictability of her dependence. In court, every gesture was analysed, every alliance precarious. Even trusted advisors carried ambitions that threatened to overshadow their loyalty. But the mistress had no such ambitions. Her world existed because he allowed it. Her security came from satisfying expectations he rarely articulated. Her attention, Her silence, her presence, all were shaped by the boundaries he set. In her company, he did not have to negotiate authority, he simply possessed it. She, in turn, learned to navigate the fine line between pleasing him and preserving herself. Her survival demanded constant awareness of his moods. A misplaced word could shrink her influence. A moment of coldness could place her at risk. She watched him with careful eyes, interpreting each subtle shift in tone or posture. She adjusted her behavior accordingly, smoothing tension before it settled, offering warmth before he asked for it, retreating when he grew distant. Her role was as much emotional labor as companionship. This dynamic reassured the king in ways he never admitted. In the palace, challenges pressed against him from all sides. Foreign threats loomed. Domestic disputes simmered. Internal doubts whispered at inconvenient times. But in the mistress's chamber, none of those uncertainties mattered. He entered a world where his voice carried finality, where his presence alone shaped the atmosphere. If he wanted silence, she provided it. If he wanted attention, she offered it. If he wanted a distraction, she supplied it without hesitation. Such power created a deceptive sense of safety. The king convinced himself that this relationship revealed the true nature of loyalty. Unquestioning, immediate, and absolute. He mistook dependence for devotion, compliance for affection. The imbalance comforted him, reinforcing the belief that control was the cornerstone of intimacy. Yet beneath this illusion lay a truth he never confronted. Her loyalty was circumstantial, as fragile as the favor that sustained it. The mistress lived with the constant knowledge that her life could change abruptly. She saw the transient nature of her position in every discarded gift from previous favorites, in the quiet stories whispered by servants about women who once held influence but now lived far from the palace. She knew she existed in borrowed light, but rather than resist the imbalance, she mastered it. Dependence became a tool she wielded with subtle skill, appearing vulnerable enough to soften him, yet capable enough to anchor his attention. The king relied on this version of her. He admired her readiness to soothe him after political storms. He valued her predictability. The way she stabilized emotional turbulence he dared not reveal to the queen or the court. Her dependence bolstered his confidence. Her fear of losing him reinforced his sense of indispensability. Their bond, shaped by power, became a reflection of his deepest insecurity, the need to feel irreplaceable. What he did not see was the quiet toll the imbalance took on her spirit. Each day required performance, careful maintenance of the persona that pleased him. Her true thoughts remained buried beneath gestures crafted to ensure her survival. She felt the weight of her own silence, the pressure to remain agreeable, even when fear tightened in her chest. Yet she adapted, because adapting was the only path available to her. The king believed he controlled the relationship entirely. But dependency is never unidirectional. His sense of security grew so tethered to her presence that he often returned not out of desire, but out of the fear of facing uncertainty alone. Control, once comforting, became a need. Without realizing it, he relied on the very dependence he thought benefited her alone. It is unsettling how power convinces itself that imbalance creates safety rather than distortion. If placed in a modern context, it would resemble someone mistaking obedience for love simply because the other person cannot afford to leave. I cannot ignore how the king's confidence was built upon a foundation that trembled beneath the quiet weight of her fear. Their bond thrived on control, not connection. Somewhere inside that structure, the king began to confuse dominance with closeness. Many later whispered that the real fracture appeared when he finally sensed how much of himself depended on someone who had no freedom at all. Loneliness crept into the king's life in ways he never anticipated. It did not arrive dramatically, nor did it declare itself with force. It settled quietly, filling the spaces between obligations. slipping into the pauses of royal ceremonies, lingering at the edges of every carefully orchestrated interaction. Power surrounded him at all times, yet none of it softened the silence that pressed against him when the doors of the council chamber finally closed. Influence could command armies, but it could not summon comfort. Authority could silence dissent, but it could not silence the ache that followed him into his private chambers. He first sensed this emptiness during moments of triumph, victories celebrated by courtiers who praised him with rehearsed enthusiasm. Their smiles were sharp, their compliments polished, their loyalty conditional. He heard their flattery, but not affection. He felt their proximity, but not presence. The more he gained in status, the less he found in human closeness. Power magnified everything except the feeling he needed most, a sense that someone saw the man beneath the crown. When loneliness grew too heavy, he sought not companionship, but sensation, something capable of distracting him from the hollow places within. Newness offered that escape, the unfamiliar gesture, the unpolished voice, the quickened thrill of desire untouched by protocol. All of it held a temporary power that soothed him more effectively than counsel or ceremony ever could. Novel feelings did not require explanation. They did not ask for reasons or meaning. They simply swept him away from the echo of his own solitude. A mistress became the vessel for that escape. She represented not stability, but interruption. Her presence disrupted the monotony of ruling, giving him a brief taste of unpredictability in a life otherwise shaped by rigid order. When he stepped into her room, the air felt different, not heavy with expectation, but charged with possibility. He did not need to craft speeches or maintain composure. He did not need to anticipate the reactions of a watching court. He could allow sensation to replace thought, letting instinct take the place of duty. For a man accustomed to scrutiny, this freedom felt intoxicating. The mistress's laughter, unrestrained and uncalculated, cut through the surrounding emptiness. Her touch, unshaped by etiquette, he startled him into remembering he had a body, not just a throne. Her gaze did not evaluate him, it simply landed upon him, and that alone felt like relief. He mistook this relief for connection, though deep within, he knew it was merely a temporary balm. She, too, understood her role in this ritual of escape. Her presence was not meant to fill the emptiness, only to divert it. She offered comfort shaped by the knowledge that it would never extend into permanence. Each gesture, each moment of closeness, each whispered word was crafted to soothe him without lingering too long. She knew better than to offer deeper affection. True intimacy belonged to a world she could not inhabit. Her purpose was sensation, not salvation. Yet even as he recognized the temporary nature of their bond, he found himself returning again and again, drawn by the fleeting softness it provided. His loneliness did not disappear. It merely receded long enough for him to believe it was manageable. He felt alive in those stolen moments, as though the weight of ruling had loosened its grip. But when the encounter ended, and he stepped back into the palace halls, the emptiness seeped in once more, deeper than before. He began to understand that sensation was not a cure, only a pause, and pauses, by nature, ended quickly. Still, he chased them, not because he believed they would save him, but because they allowed him to forget the truth, that power could isolate a man more thoroughly than exile. The higher he ascended, the fewer people remained who could speak to him without fear. Loneliness became the shadow that followed him everywhere, and the mistress became the flame he held against it. Small, flickering, insufficient, yet impossible to release. She noticed the change in him as well. His visits carried an urgency that had nothing to do with passion. He sought reassurance, even when he could not articulate what needed to be soothed. She listened, knowing her silence was part of the illusion he needed to maintain. She offered closeness that dissolved quickly, knowing that if it lasted, it would undo them both. Her role was to ease, not to heal, but sensation, once relied upon, demands repetition, and repetition becomes dependency. The king leaned more heavily upon the escape she offered, unaware that each retreat into her world widened the gap between him and the life he was trying to avoid. The throne felt colder after each visit. The palace felt larger. His own loneliness grew sharper, because now he knew what temporary relief felt like and how quickly it slipped from his grasp. It is almost tragic how a man surrounded by power can be undone by the simple ache of feeling unseen. If placed in a modern era, it would resemble someone reaching endlessly for distractions that fade the moment the room goes quiet. I cannot ignore how the mistress became less a companion and more a mirror, reflecting everything he wished he could escape. Sensation quieted the emptiness, but never erased it. In that fragile silence, the king drifted further from the truth he feared most. Some later whispered that the real danger began when sensation started to feel like the only place he could breathe. Public life demanded that the king embody an ideal, so polished it barely resembled a human shape. From dawn until the last fading echo of ceremony at night, he was required to stand as the model of certainty, unwavering, unerring, unbreakable. Every gesture he made carried symbolic weight. Every silence was interpreted. Every decision became a reflection of the nation's strength. There was no room for hesitation, no permission for doubt. The title consumed the man, moulding him into something both admired and impossibly distant. Behind this facade grew a quiet exhaustion. Perfection was not only expected, it was rehearsed into him until he could no longer distinguish performance from identity. Courts and councils looked to him for solutions, but none asked whether he felt overwhelmed. Advisors praised his composure, unaware of the strain it took to maintain. Even the queen, bound by her own expectations, saw him through the lens of monarchy rather than intimacy. Strength was not a choice. It was a constant demand that allowed no interruption. In private moments, he felt the contradiction press deepest. The more perfect he appeared, the more alone he became. Vulnerability had no place on the throne. The kingdom admired the version of him that did not falter. Yet he could not sustain that version without losing pieces of himself. He longed for a place where the ideal could slip away, where humanity might surface without punishment. Power required distance, but distance slowly starved him of the closeness he quietly craved. A mistress offered the escape he could not find elsewhere. Her chamber held no portraits of ancestors, reminding him of the standards he must uphold. No advisors lingered outside the door, waiting to correct his posture or refine his tone. In that small, imperfect space, the king could exhale without shaping the breath into authority. He allowed the stiffness in his shoulders to soften. He allowed fatigue to settle openly across his face. Here, weakness did not signal danger. It simply existed. She did not demand the idealized king. She did not require him to speak with conviction or mask uncertainty behind royal phrasing. Her presence created a space where he could hesitate without consequence. Some evenings, he arrived silent, carrying the weight of decisions that had drained him. She did not ask for explanations. She understood that silence could be a form of unraveling. Another night, she spoke with a trembling honesty he would never reveal in the palace. Fears about succession, doubts about judgment, confusion he could not admit publicly. His imperfections unfolded slowly, like something long restrained. In her company, he realized how rarely he had allowed himself to be human. The palace trained him to be immovable. She reminded him he was mortal. The contrast unsettled him at first. Vulnerability felt dangerous, even in such a private room. But the more he allowed himself to be imperfect, the more he recognized how deeply he needed that release. With her, he did not need to uphold a kingdom's image. He did not need to act as the embodiment of order. He could be uncertain, conflicted, worn. Parts of himself the throne refused to acknowledge. She noticed these shifts quietly. She saw the way his hands trembled after long counsels, the way he sank into a chair without the posture expected of him, the way his eyes lost focus when the performance of the day finally loosened its grip. She responded not with pity, but with presence. Her acceptance created a strange, fragile comfort. He could unravel slightly without losing dignity. His flaws, once hidden beneath layers of duty, became something he no longer feared showing. This imperfection did not make him weak. It made him real. But the palace had no interest in what was real. It wanted only the flawless facade. And so he returned to her again and again, drawn by the permission she granted. Permission to be tired. Permission to be unsure. Permission to be less than ideal. In a world carved from expectations, such permission felt like a rare form of generosity. He began to recognize the danger. 2. Dependence on imperfection created a new imbalance. The more freely he revealed his weaknesses, the more he needed her to witness them. He risked building a version of himself that existed only in her presence. A man stripped of armor, barely recognizable outside her room. And yet, he continued to seek that version, because the throne would never tolerate him as anything less than perfect. It is striking how the cost of power often reveals itself not through failure, but through the slow erosion of a person's right to be flawed. If translated into the modern world, it mirrors someone forced to perform confidence daily while quietly searching for a place to fall apart. I cannot help noticing how the mistress became the only witness to the parts of him he was never allowed to keep. Imperfection softened him in ways the crown never could. Somewhere in that hidden space, he rediscovered the man buried beneath the symbol. Many later murmured that the true fracture emerged the moment he realized the throne admired his strength. But only she recognized his truth. Life as a monarch meant existing beneath an unblinking gaze. The king could walk through a hall lined with courtiers and feel 100 interpretations forming before he reached the far doorway. Every nod became a statement. Every expression invited speculation. Even the pace of his steps carried meaning that others eagerly dissected. There was no gesture too small to escape notice. He lived inside a cage made not of iron, but of observation, an endless scrutiny that shaped him more tightly than any law. People imagined his power granted him freedom, but the opposite proved truer. Power demanded visibility. His face belonged to the nation. His speech belonged to the ceremony. His presence served as reassurance in times of uncertainty. Privacy, once a natural human right, became a luxury carved away piece by piece, until nothing remained but duty. Even in his private chambers, he felt the residue of eyes on him, as though the walls themselves recorded his movements. This constant exposure blurred the boundaries between self and symbol. Over time, he realized the kingdom no longer saw a man, only an emblem, a representation of stability, a figure expected to embody virtues he could not always maintain. His exhaustion, physical or emotional, never permitted him to withdraw. He had to be present, composed, unshakable. A single moment of weakness could ripple through the court, sowing doubts that took months to repair. He began to lose his sense of interiority. The private world that all people rely upon to feel grounded. Thoughts became harder to claim as his own when each carried consequences. Feelings became burdens rather than truths. Even silence felt observed. The life he lived did not allow for a self that existed outside performance. He found himself yearning, not for escape, but simply for a place where no one required anything from him. Not judgment, not strength, not certainty. The mistress offered a faint echo of that space. It was not real privacy. Nothing in a king's life ever truly was. But it resembled privacy enough that he clung to it. Her room was small, modest, and dimly lit. a sharp contrast to the grand chambers bursting with ceremonial meaning. When he crossed its threshold, something loosened within him. Not freedom, but something close enough to blur the ache. Her presence did not demand a polished image. She did not watch him for the sake of reporting. She did not measure his worth through symbolic gestures. When he entered, she did not analyze the angle of his shoulders or the weight of his tone. Her attention was quieter, lighter, free of the burden carried by the court. Even if her interest was shaped by dependence, it lacked the sharpness of expectation. He felt, briefly, unseen in the way he desperately needed. Unseen, not as invisibility, but as release from judgment. In that room, he could let stillness settle without rushing to fill it. He could sit without performing composure, speak without calculating consequence, breathe without imagining how each breath might be interpreted. The absence of scrutiny created an illusion of intimacy that felt softer than truth but more comforting than reality. He knew this illusion was fragile, built on circumstance rather than connection. But illusions often provide more solace than facts. She watched him with curiosity rather than evaluation. Her gaze held no political weight. When he hesitated mid-sentence, she did not search for hidden meaning. When his voice faltered, she did not fear the collapse of the realm. He could unravel slightly without creating a disaster. This, more than desire, drew him back to her. In her presence, he could exist without performance. Slipping momentarily out of the symbolic body, the kingdom demanded. Of course, the privacy she offered was only partial. He remained aware that their relationship, if discovered or whispered, carried its own risks. But the illusion of privacy, however delicate, still gave him relief. For a man carved into a national emblem, illusion became a kind of sanctuary. He clung to it not because it was real, but because it was the closest thing he could reach. He learned to measure time differently in her room. Minutes softened. The pressure of obligation faded around the edges. He found himself sinking into moments rather than calculating outcomes. Even his breathing changed, shifting from controlled to natural. These small transformations reminded him of who he might have been without a crown. A thought both comforting and painful. Yet illusions do not erase truth. When he stepped back into the palace halls, the gaze returned instantly. The burden settled again upon his shoulders. He became once more the emblem the kingdom required. But now, the contrast was sharper. The momentary stillness he experienced made the scrutiny feel harsher than before, as though returning to daylight after being in a quiet, shaded room. It is unsettling how a man known across a kingdom can feel most invisible to himself. Placed in a modern world, it resembles someone admired by millions, yet unable to find a single moment that belongs solely to them. I cannot help noticing how the illusion of privacy mattered more to him than the reality of power. Scrutiny shaped his days, but longing shaped his nights. Somewhere within that fragile contrast, he began slipping further into a world where nothing was demanded of him. Many later murmured that the first true crack formed the night he realized the emblem everyone revered had little connection to the man he actually was. Status in a royal court was a language spoken without words. It appeared in the embroidered cuffs of a nobleman's coat, in the measured distance between ranks during ceremonies, in the way servants bowed just slightly lower before certain figures. Everything signaled something, and everyone understood the hierarchy without needing it explained. Within this rigid structure, the king stood at its pinnacle, not only because of authority, but because of the privileges that authority granted. Among these privileges, one carried a particularly potent symbolic weight: the possession of a mistress. Courtiers rarely spoke openly about it, but their glances said enough. A mistress was more than a woman. She was a marker of influence. Only a man with unquestioned power could afford such an arrangement. Only someone shielded by status could surround himself with desire without risking public ruin. The higher the throne, the fewer consequences existed. In this way, the king's mistress became a visible extension of his dominance, a silent emblem of what others envied but dared not pursue. For him, the dynamic offered a complex thrill. She represented something unattainable to most men at court, not because of her beauty, though that played its part, but because of what her presence signified. She embodied access, privilege, and exclusivity. Her closeness reminded him of the distance between his world and theirs. The court could admire him, to fear him, obey him, but only he could claim her. The knowledge that she was available to him and him alone fed a pleasure rooted not in affection, but in the affirmation of power. She understood this unspoken arrangement long before he realized its depth. Her position was precarious, yet undeniably elevated. Servants treated her with careful deference. Ladies of the court watched her with thin smiles that concealed hostility. Men measured their words around her, uncertain whether she carried the king's ear. She walked through rooms with a presence not earned by lineage, but bestowed by attention. Such elevation was both intoxicating and terrifying. She had climbed high, but she did so without railings. Her identity became entangled with the idea of being chosen. The court whispered that she should feel grateful. That selection by the king was a kind of coronation, even if unofficial. She felt the pressure of that expectation, sensing how her worth had become intertwined with his desire. Being chosen granted her safety, gifts, and influence, but it also tethered her completely to his favor. The higher she rose, the farther she had to fall. The king, however, reveled in the dynamic. Her presence reinforced the notion that he alone could shape the court's reality. The world watched him, and he watched her. Every room she entered carried the echo of his authority. Every gesture she made drew significance from the fact that it pleased him. Even the queen, bound by duty and rank, could not replicate the spontaneity of choosing a mistress, a decision made not for alliances or bloodlines, but for desire. This choice, though fraught with consequences, felt like an assertion of personal will in a life where personal choice had become rare. He found a peculiar satisfaction in knowing she benefited from his status. The gifts he offered, the protection he extended, and the rooms he assigned to her created a world she could not have accessed alone. Watching her navigate this world, hesitant at first, then more assured, gave him a sense of ownership that extended beyond affection. Her transformation into a figure of influence seemed to reflect his power, as though he had sculpted not only her life, but the perception others held of her. Yet beneath the appearances lurked a truth neither dared voice. Their bond was rooted in imbalance. She was elevated only because he lifted her. He felt desirable only because she confirmed his dominance. Their connection thrived not on equality, but on dependency and privilege. When he looked at her, he sometimes wondered how much of her affection was genuine and how much was necessity, but he rarely allowed the question to linger. It was easier to believe that desire affirmed his worth than to confront the vulnerability beneath the illusion. For her, the act of being chosen was both a blessing and a burden. She felt the eyes of the court, judging her presence as though she carried something stolen. She sensed envy woven into every whisper, yet she also sensed the king's unspoken satisfaction, and that alone ensured her survival. She learned quickly that being chosen was not enough. She had to remain desirable, valuable, irreplaceable. Her days became a performance of subtle, emotional labor, shaping herself into whatever the king needed, fearing the moment he might seek novelty elsewhere. In this gilded imbalance, they found a rhythm, one shaped by his desire to assert power and her need to maintain position. Each benefited in visible ways, while slowly eroding private truths beneath the surface. He clung to the illusion of control. She clung to the illusion of security. Both illusions were fragile, yet both carried enough weight to keep them intertwined. It is remarkable how desire can become a currency, traded not for affection but for proof of power. Placed in a modern world, it resembles someone mistaking exclusivity for love simply because they hold the upper hand. I cannot ignore how the act of choosing her said far more about his hunger for validation than about any bond between them. Privilege shaped their closeness more than tenderness ever could. Somewhere within that imbalance, each learned to lean on illusions that comforted them differently. Whispers later hinted that the facade first cracked when she understood that being chosen also meant belonging. Escapes often appear most inviting at the moment a person feels trapped. And for the king, the mistress became that tempting doorway. She seemed to promise warmth where the palace walls felt cold, softness where duty felt rigid, and possibility where routine had stripped life of surprise. Yet beneath the surface of that comfort lay a truth he refused to confront. She did not lead him anywhere. She simply allowed him to pause in a place that felt different enough to mimic change. A pause, however soothing, is not a direction. Time inside her chamber slipped away with deceptive ease. The king allowed himself to believe that the quiet there offered clarity. That desire could reshape the emptiness carved by years of obligation. But clarity never arrived. The same burdens waited outside the moment he rose from her bed, and the same doubts followed him down the corridor. He returned to the palace halls, unchanged, though briefly distracted, like a man stepping out of a storm only to walk back into it moments later. She provided comfort. Yes, but comfort is not a resolution. Their closeness soothed the symptoms of his unrest while leaving its root untouched. The loneliness bred by power, the hollowing silence of responsibility, the weight of expectations that reshaped every breath. None of it dissolved in her presence. It merely retreated, hiding in the folds of pleasure and conversation, lingering until the moment he stepped away. Relief masqueraded as healing, and he welcomed that illusion, even as he sensed its fragility. The mistress understood this long before he did. She knew she was not on a path forward, only a place to rest, a decorated cul-de-sac dressed in warmth and intimacy. Her role was to distract, not transform. Yet she performed this role with precision, creating a space where the king could forget the chaos of his life. If only briefly, she softened the corners of his exhaustion, absorbed the rough edges of his frustration, and reflected versions of him that felt less burdened. But she could not alter the structure of his world. For her, too, the arrangement was a dead end. Whatever influence she managed to gather existed only because he permitted it. Whatever security she felt remained tethered to his desire. She walked through her days, knowing the illusion of importance could vanish the moment he lost interest. The comfort she offered became a kind of labor, and the affection she displayed, however genuine in moments, was shaped by necessity. She decorated the cul-de-sac, but she lived in it as well, with fewer exits than he ever realized. The king occasionally wondered why his life felt unchanged despite the sanctuary she provided. He sensed a cycle forming, tension rising, seeking escape, finding it, losing it, returning to duty, and repeating the pattern when the weight grew too heavy again. Each visit felt urgent, then necessary, then expected. The temporary relief began to resemble dependence, and dependence began to resemble entrapment. What once appeared as freedom now revealed its own walls. He had mistaken movement for progress. The mistress offered movement, emotional, physical, and sensory, but none of it moved him toward anything. Pleasure eased the ache, but never removed it. Affection softened the loneliness, but never replaced it. Even vulnerability in her presence, which once felt profound, began to feel contained, almost rehearsed. He had not changed, he had only paused. Sometimes he left her room with a lingering warmth, believing that the night held significance. But by dawn, the quiet ache returned, sharper than before, as if reminding him that comfort borrowed always requires repayment. His life felt suspended between obligation and escape. Yet neither space offered the fulfillment he sought. The cul-de-sac had grown familiar, pleasant, even, but he remained no closer to answering the questions that plagued him. And still, he returned. Not because he believed she was the answer, but because he feared the silence that greeted him when he tried to face his life alone. It was easier to choose distraction over truth, comfort over clarity, repetition over change. He clung to the decorated cul-de-sac because the road ahead felt too dark to enter without a guiding hand. It is striking how longing can mistake a painted wall for an open door. Placed in a modern world, it resembles someone returning to the same fleeting comfort, hoping each time it will finally become enough. I cannot help noticing how the king feared stillness more than he feared being lost. The sanctuary he cherished was never meant to lead him forward. Somewhere in that fragile quiet, he began to hear the echo of problems the room could not silence. Rumor later suggested the turning point came the night he realized he was walking in circles. Comfortably, beautifully, but still in circles. Patterns often reveal truths long before people are willing to confront them. In the king's life, one pattern emerged with a clarity that unsettled even those accustomed to palace intrigue. Mistresses appeared and disappeared with a frequency that mirrored a deeper, quieter unrest. Each arrival carried the promise of renewal, and each departure left behind an emptiness disguised as indifference. The court treated these transitions as trivial shifts in preference, but beneath them lay a hunger that no single woman could satisfy. The first mistress had once seemed irreplaceable. Her presence softened the sharpness of duty. Her laughter filled the hollow spaces left by endless ceremony. And for a time, she felt essential to his nights. But as the months passed, the novelty that made their closeness vivid began to fade. Conversations that once felt intimate grew repetitive. Gestures, once charged with excitement, now settled into predictability. She remained the same. Yet he felt different. Restless, vaguely disappointed, unable to internalize the simple truth that comfort alone could not cure his deeper solitude. Another woman entered his orbit soon after, carrying a softness the first lacked, or a sharpness, or a charm. Any difference was enough to hold his attention. The shift was subtle at first, a quiet curiosity that slowly grew into desire. The old mistress sensed the change in the way he hesitated before visiting her chambers, in the lowered intensity of his gaze, in the silence that lingered too long between them. She understood what was coming. The palace had its cycle, and she was nearing its end. When he eventually drifted toward the new mistress, he convinced himself that this time felt different, that her voice stirred something deeper, that her manner revived a part of him long dormant. He believed, sincerely for a moment, that he had found what the others lacked. But the pattern returned with relentless precision. Weeks or months later, the thrill softened into habit, and habit into restlessness, loneliness, patient and persistent, resurfaced exactly where he had left it. He mistook movement for satisfaction. Each new face, each new touch, each new whisper in the dark created a brief surge of meaning that evaporated as soon as familiarity settled in. It was not the women who failed him. It was the structure of his longing, an emptiness too vast for any single person to sustain. The palace could admire him, the council could fear him, and the nation could revere him. But none of these affections filled the internal quiet that accompanied his every triumph. The women he left behind rarely spoke of their experiences, but their silence did not hide the truth. They learned quickly that affection from a king was as fleeting as sunlight passing through a narrow window, favoured in one season, forgotten in the next. Their lives shifted with his restlessness, rising briefly into comfort, before sinking back into obscurity. Some adapted with practiced resignation, others carried the bitterness quietly, a few disappeared entirely, swallowed by the anonymity that awaited those who no longer held the monarch's attention. The court watched these transitions with a mixture of fascination and dread. Nobles speculated about the qualities that captured his interest, as though desire could be measured or predicted. Savants, who witnessed more than anyone realized, understood that the problem had little to do with the women and everything to do with the king's widening emotional void. Each new mistress initially filled the emptiness with sweetness or novelty or distraction. But each ultimately confronted the same impossibility. He sought not a person, but a feeling that could not survive repetition. He never allowed himself to name this truth. Instead, he convinced himself that one more change might finally bring contentment. He reached for newness, the way a drowning man reaches for drifting wood, not to live, but to avoid sinking. Yet every time he resurfaced, he found himself just as lost, held afloat only by the temporary comfort of another woman's presence. Behind closed doors, the pattern hardened into habit. He visited new chambers, learned new voices, tasted new forms of intimacy, all the while repeating the same internal cycle: anticipation, fulfillment, softness, dullness, and then the quiet pull towards something else. Emotional consumption replaced emotional connection. Desire transformed into distraction, and distraction into necessity. The cycle did not heal him. It only masked the depth of his dissatisfaction. It is haunting how novelty can feel like salvation until it becomes routine. Placed in a modern world, it resembles someone scrolling endlessly through fleeting pleasures, convinced the next face might finally fill the void. I cannot ignore how his restlessness revealed more about what he lacked inside than what any mistress failed to provide. Change brought him temporary warmth, but no lasting peace. Somewhere within that repetition, he began to realize that the women were not the problem. His yearning was. Whispers later claimed the turning point came when he finally saw his own reflection in the pattern he kept repeating. Novelty began as a gentle pull, something the king reached for only when the palace felt particularly suffocating. At first, it offered a spark, a breath of color cutting through the monotony of duty. But over time, that spark evolved into something sharper, more consuming. Familiarity, once comforting, now dulled him. The emotions he experienced with women he had known for months no longer stirred him with the same intensity. What once felt intimate now felt predictable. What once soothed him now barely touched the edges of his restlessness. He started to crave the rush that accompanied newness. The small shock of encountering a voice he had never heard, a gesture he had never seen, a softness or boldness that reminded him he was still capable of feeling something immediate. Novelty became the closest thing to aliveness he recognized. Without it, the days blurred, flattening into one another until even pleasure felt like obligation. He feared that stillness more than he feared judgment. This craving sharpened quickly. The king found himself scanning the court with new eyes, not seeking companionship, but searching for sensation, a glance that lingered too long, a smile that carried unfamiliar warmth, a posture that hinted at confidence or shyness he had not yet tasted. It no longer mattered who the woman was. What mattered was that she was not one he already knew. Desire detached from personhood. It became hunger for difference. The mistresses closest to him sensed this shift instinctively. They saw the way his gaze drifted. They felt the subtle cooling of his visits. They recognized the pattern long before he acknowledged it. His attention receded like a tide, pulling away from those who once served as sanctuary, seeking new shores that promised excitement. Their hands, once enough to steady him, no longer sparked the emotional surprise he needed. Their voices, once soothing, now sounded too familiar. They had become echoes of feelings he had already consumed. He moved through these transitions with a calmness that concealed the turmoil beneath. Outwardly, he appeared serene, even thoughtful. Inwardly, he chased stimulation with growing urgency. The problem was not dissatisfaction with a single woman, it was dissatisfaction with repetition itself. Every encounter risked becoming part of a memory he had already lived. And this repetition frightened him. He feared emotional numbness more than he feared moral consequence. The court whispered about his shifting preferences. Assuming vanity or lust drove him. But those explanations were too simple. His longing was not rooted in conquest. It was rooted in desperation. Novelty allowed him to outrun the emptiness for a few precious nights. It reminded him that life still pulsed beneath the weight of the crown. But like all fleeting pleasures, the relief faded quickly. Each time he returned to his duties, the dull ache felt heavier, as though the thrill had carved out even more space inside him. Mistresses became not partners, but experiences. Moments consumed, then placed aside. He did not intend cruelty. Yet cruelty blossomed in the structure itself. Women were elevated briefly, wrapped in the warmth of his attention, then abandoned when their presence no longer cut sharply through the monotony. Some tried to hold his interest, shaping their behavior to match the spark he sought. Others withdrew quietly, understanding that trying to compete with newness was a battle already lost. He told himself he was searching for something meaningful. But the truth slid beneath that explanation. He was searching for stimulation strong enough to overpower the numbness. Every new mistress delayed that numbness a little longer, like drops of fire across a frozen surface. But fire burns quickly, and he needed more each time. What once satisfied him for months now lasted only weeks. The cycle hardened, and with it, his dependence on the thrill. Novelty was no longer an escape, it was a need. A pulse he returned to repeatedly, unable to resist its draw. But the more he consumed, the less it satisfied. Each encounter ended with a familiar hollowness settling back into place, followed by the quiet realization that he had once again mistaken excitement for fulfillment. It is unsettling how quickly the search for feeling can become the search for intensity alone. Placed in a modern world, it resembles someone scrolling endlessly for stimulation, convinced the next flash of excitement will finally fill the emptiness. I cannot help noticing how each new mistress became not a connection, but a symptom of a longing he refused to name. Desire sharpened into habit, then into hunger. Somewhere in that growing urgency, he began to lose sight of what he was truly chasing. Rumor later held that the breaking point surfaced when he realized novelty no longer lifted him. It simply delayed the fall. Loneliness did not arrive suddenly for the king. It settled slowly. Like dust gathering in corners, he no longer noticed. Even with the presence of mistresses, courtiers, advisors, and an entire kingdom awaiting his orders, an emptiness followed him from chamber to chamber. It lingered behind him during feasts, pressed against him during councils, and lay beside him in the quiet hours before dawn. Every new attachment had promised relief, yet none of them touched the hollow space growing beneath his certainty. What he chased felt alive for a moment, then faded, leaving silence sharper than before. Each relationship he formed became more fragile than the last, not because the women lacked devotion, but because he no longer trusted what devotion meant. A whisper of affection made him question motives. A gentle gesture made him wonder whether loyalty was genuine or simply another performance expected of those who stood too close to power. The crown created a distance he could not bridge. No matter how many times he tried to be just a man in private, even in moments of intimacy, he sensed that the room saw the king first, and the person beneath him only as an after-effect. This suspicion infected everything. When a mistress laughed, he questioned the sincerity. When she comforted him, he wondered whether she feared losing her place. When she hesitated, even for an instant, he imagined betrayal. Trust, once natural, became rare. He began to search for hidden meanings in every glance. Every pause, every shift of posture, the burden of being revered eroded the possibility of being understood. It is strangely cruel how power draws people close, yet prevents true closeness from forming. As the years passed, he realized that the more he was admired, the more isolated he felt. Respect carried weight, but it did not warm him. Loyalty looked impressive on paper, but it did not soften the nights. Even love, if it appeared, felt tainted by the question he could never silence. Did they love him? Or did they love the crown? That doubt carved deeper into him with each passing mistress, each fleeting connection, each whispered promise that evaporated when the moment faded. The palace did nothing to ease this. Its corridors stretched endlessly, designed for grandeur rather than comfort. Its etiquette demanded perfection, preventing vulnerability at every turn. Even alone, he found himself sitting upright, speaking carefully, breathing as though someone were always listening. Mistresses offered temporary refuge, but the refuge belonged more to the fantasy than to the women themselves. When their novelty faded, his thoughts returned to the same quiet ache, the realization that even surrounded by people, he remained unseen. This hollowing effect grew more pronounced as his authority increased. Paradoxically, the higher he rose, the deeper he sank within himself. Decisions that once felt clear became heavy. Praise that once flattered now sounded distant and rehearsed. He lived in a world shaped by his commands, yet he wondered whether any command could shape the loneliness that trailed him like a shadow. Power amplified everything except the connection. Some nights, he felt the weight of his choices settle like cold air in a locked room. The mistresses who once comforted him now appeared as reminders of a cycle he could not escape. He had reached for them, hoping for warmth, distraction, or proof that he still mattered. Instead, each encounter revealed another layer of the void he had been trying to outrun. The more he tried to fill it, the more it expanded. A quiet irony, the man with everything lacked the one thing he could never demand. His courtiers noticed the change, though none dared to name it. They saw the dimming of interest, the heaviness behind his eyes, the way he lingered in silence before answering questions. But they misread it as fatigue or contemplation. No one imagined that the king, surrounded by luxury, attended by admirers, adorned in symbols of absolute authority, could feel profoundly alone. The throne elevated him above others, but elevation came with thin air. It is unsettling to watch how power can hollow a man while convincing him he is complete. Placed in a modern setting, he resembles someone scrolling endlessly through connections, yet feeling untouched by every one of them. I cannot forget how the court mistook his silence for strength when it was simply the exhaustion of a heart stretched too thin. Loneliness followed him into every chamber, somewhere between desire and doubt. He realized he no longer believed in the affection offered to him. Quiet voices later suggested the truth emerged only when he admitted to himself that emptiness had begun to feel familiar. A man wandering through the royal residence after midnight would immediately sense a tension stitched into the stillness. The torches flickered with a tired glow. The corridors held their breath, and the tapestries seemed to sag under the weight of unspoken fatigue. In that dim and heavy quiet, the sight of a king turning toward a mistress no longer appeared scandalous. It looked like the natural consequence of a system stretched far beyond what any human could endure. The palace demanded perfection, but perfection had begun to collapse under its own expectations. The structure of the court continued to function with mechanical precision. The council met, documents circulated, and orders were given without hesitation. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet anyone who observed closely would notice the way people moved, stiff, measured, vari. The king felt it most sharply. The face he wore before his subjects was still strong, but the life behind that expression had grown thin. Every conversation felt scripted. Every exchange carried layers of obligation. Even the simple act of being seen became exhausting. Surrounded by attendants, advisors, guards, and nobles, he had never been more isolated. They bowed. They listened. They executed commands flawlessly, but none of them truly heard him. Their loyalty was genuine, yet shaped entirely by duty. They saw the crown, not the man beneath it. A mistress slipped into that blind spot, not because she was glamorous or irresistible, but because she did not belong to the bureaucratic machinery. She represented a space untouched by protocol, a place where he could exist without performing. Inside the palace, expectations multiplied with every passing season. Ceremonies demanded his presence. Alliances required his attention. The nation projected its hopes onto a single figure, and the strain of carrying that weight hollowed out the emotional core of the throne. A mistress became a quiet rebellion against that weight, an unofficial sanctuary where he could breathe without the crown tightening around him. Her existence did not challenge the state directly, but it illuminated the emotional exhaustion that the state refused to acknowledge. The more disciplined the court became, the more fragile the king felt. Letters arrived at dawn, envoys at dusk, petitions at all hours. He moved through these duties with the precision expected of a monarch. Yet inside, the seams were loosening. The mistress did not mend those seams, she simply revealed them. Her presence showed how deeply he longed for something unregulated, something that did not serve the monarchy but served the man who had spent his life being consumed by it. In those dimly lit chambers, he did not find passion as much as quiet relief. There, he could speak without being recorded in the minds of ministers. He could falter without becoming a political liability. He could exist without being interpreted. The relationship was not an escape from responsibility, but an escape from relentless observation. His vulnerability, often hidden beneath layers of ceremony, surfaced only in these hidden moments, where no one demanded that he remain unshakable. Yet the softness of those encounters also carried a darker truth. He had lost faith in the structures meant to support him. The court no longer felt like a body working alongside its monarch. It felt like a force consuming him. Every new duty pressed deeper into his private life. Every unresolved tension echoed louder through the palace halls. The mistress acted as a barometer, reflecting how strained the entire system had become. The tragedy lay not in the affair itself, but in what it revealed. When a ruler turned to someone outside the hierarchy for comfort, it spoke to a kingdom that failed to provide room for its leader to remain human. It exposed how brittle the ideals of strength and duty had become, demanding absolute constancy from a man who could no longer carry the illusion. Sometimes he left her rooms with a deeper weariness than when he entered. The moments of honesty they shared did not lessen the burden. They simply made him aware of how heavy it truly was. But they also forced him to see that the crown had shaped and hollowed him in equal measure. The system had asked for unending devotion, and in return, it had drained him of the ability to feel whole. What existed between them was never just desire. It was a symptom, a quiet signal that the palace itself had reached a point of emotional fracture. And as the cracks widened, the king realized that his private choices were not personal failures. They were reflections of a system unraveling from within. Loneliness seeped through every ceremony, until even duty felt strangely thin. Somewhere beneath that fading certainty, he sensed that private choices were only echoes of a structure losing its balance. Soft traces hinted that what waited ahead would expose fractures the court could no longer keep hidden. There were nights when the king stepped away from the noise of the palace and discovered that the silence waiting for him felt heavier than any council chamber. The corridors were dim, the air unmoving, and the footsteps of servants faded too quickly to offer comfort. In that hollow quiet, the truth emerged with a clarity he could not escape. Not every king found satisfaction in the path he had chosen, and the presence of a mistress did not always soften the weight he carried. What began as a search for escape often became another chamber in the maze of his own loneliness. The stories told about kings and their lovers were often simplified. Tales of indulgence, desire, and the privileges of power. But behind closed doors, the reality rarely matched the legends. Relationships, built on stolen hours and concealed intentions, were fragile from the beginning. Moments of closeness flickered for a time, yet faded quickly when confronted with routine, the expectation, or emotional exhaustion. Many kings found themselves returning to these spaces, less out of longing and more out of absence, and an emptiness that refused to be filled. Some mistresses offered tenderness, others offered distraction, but none could erase the truth of a life shaped entirely by duty. A king who entered such a relationship, hoping to reclaim a sense of youth or possibility, often discovered instead that he was confronting his own limits. The temporary warmth gave way to coldness once the novelty dissolved, leaving both the king and the mistress unsure of their footing. Distance settled between them with a kind of inevitability, as though the relationship had reached the boundary of what it could provide. At times, the emotional disconnect grew long before either dared to name it. The king might still seek her company, not out of affection, but out of habit. She might still welcome him, not out of desire, but out of fear that absence meant disappearance. Each encounter carried a quiet tension, a recognition that something was slipping, yet neither knew how to stop it. The relationship continued because ending it felt like admitting that the escape had failed. Some kings hoped their mistress would revive something in them: courage, joy, or clarity. But no human could shoulder that responsibility, especially within a structure that reduced intimacy to a temporary refuge. When the king realized that the connection did not transform him, disappointment settled in like dust on a neglected room. The mistress, once seen as a spark of freedom, became another reminder of how confined his life had become. The sweetness he sought at the beginning slowly soured into a muted ache. The cold endings of these relationships left traces across the court. Though seldom spoken aloud, servants noticed fewer visits. Courtiers sensed shifts in the king's mood. The mistress herself learned to wait in a room that felt emptier each evening. What had once been a sanctuary became a place of uncertainty, and the silence between them grew until it shaped the entire atmosphere of the palace. No accusations were exchanged. No dramatic departures unfolded. Instead, the relationship thinned quietly until it could no longer hold its own weight. Sometimes the king left without explanation. Sometimes the mistress withdrew first. But regardless of who stepped away, both carried a lingering sense of having reached for something that slipped through their hands. The king felt it as a dull, returning heaviness, a recognition that even his private choices could not shield him from the emotional consequences of rule. The mistress felt it as a fading of her temporary influence, a reminder that she had been chosen for a moment, not for a life. The ending was not marked by anger, only by the cold recognition that escape had boundaries. The absence of warm memories became its own quiet wound. What remained after these relationships dissolved was not affection or gratitude, but a faint echo of running from something neither could fully define. The king walked through his duties with the awareness that his attempts at finding solace had resolved into more solitude. His chambers felt unchanged, yet he was no longer the same. A failed escape was still an escape attempted, and that attempt left shadows. Inside the palace walls, such endings were almost expected. They blended into the rhythm of power, swallowed by the endless movements of the state. Yet for the king, the hollow space left behind was unmistakable. It reminded him that desire could not rewrite his responsibilities, and temporary refuge could not transform a life built on constant vigilance. The mistress, too, returned to her own shadows, carrying the knowledge that she had been part of something that never had the foundation to endure. In the end, The king confronted a truth he rarely spoke. He had not been seeking a person as much as he had been seeking relief. The relationship failed not because of her or him, but because it was built upon the fatigue of a life he could not change. Cold endings were inevitable when warmth had never been the real purpose. What remained was the memory of having once tried to run, and the realization that the running had led nowhere. Failed comforts lingered in his thoughts long after the doors closed on what had once felt like refuge. Somewhere inside that returning quiet, he sensed his choices revealed more about exhaustion than desire. Faint signs suggested that what lay ahead would confront him with consequences he had tried to ignore. Evening settled over the palace in a way that made the stone corridors feel heavier than the crown itself. And the king soon realized that every supposed refuge he had chased through the years had guided him back to the same hollow place. The tapestries hung without movement. The fading candles cast long shadows, and the quiet pressed against him like something alive. In that stillness, a truth sharper than any judgment revealed itself. The search that had carried him through youth, novelty, and fleeting companionship had never been directed toward another person. It had always been aimed at an escape he could not reach. The presence of mistresses became woven into the story of his life, as though each offered a doorway out of the suffocating rituals of rule. Youth shimmered with promise. Newness created the illusion of air in a room that had grown tight with expectations. The hush beyond the reach of council chambers felt like a stolen breath. Yet none of these things held the strength to shift the true weight upon him. They softened the edge only briefly, like fabric wrapped around a blade that never dulled. For a time, he convinced himself these moments mattered, that stepping into another chamber or another embrace opened a path toward the man he once hoped to be. But the pattern repeated with mechanical certainty. Warmth faded. Novelty dimmed. Silence thickened. And his duties reclaimed him unchanged. What he had mistaken for solace was only a pause. What he had mistaken for transformation was merely a distraction. The women who passed through his life became symbols not of desire, but of his internal fracture. One reflected admiration. Another reflected tenderness. Another reflected renewal. Yet beneath their presence lay the same realization. Nothing they offered could reshape the emotional architecture of his throne. They were not the problem. Nor were they the solution. They were markers. Evidence of a burden that had grown too heavy for escape to be anything more than imagination. He stepped into their rooms not in pursuit of affection, but in pursuit of forgetting. Forgetting the vigilance required of him. Forgetting the loneliness of being a national emblem rather than a man. Forgetting the expectations that clung to his every movement. But forgetting was never permanent. It faded as quickly as candlelight, leaving him once again inside walls that demanded he perform a version of himself he no longer recognized. Some mistresses sensed the truth long before he could articulate it. Their eyes held a quiet knowledge. They understood they were not what he longed for. They saw the exhaustion beneath his gestures, the restraint beneath his attempts at ease, the distance that widened even when he tried to draw near. They, too, carried their own reasons for being there. Fear, hope, ambition, survival. But all of them became part of a cycle that none of them controlled. He grew older inside that cycle. The novelty he once pursued began to taste familiar, almost predictable. The doors he opened all led to the same emotional landscape. What he had believed were variations were only repetitions dressed differently. Each relationship confirmed the same conclusion. He was running toward nothing more than temporary erasure. Eventually, clarity arrived without drama. Perhaps it took shape during a long walk through a silent hallway. Perhaps it settled upon him while watching a fire shrink to embers. Or perhaps it came when he looked at a mistress and felt an ache not of desire, but of understanding. An understanding that neither she nor anyone else could grant him freedom from a life built on expectations he could not abandon. Youth had been a symbol. Novelty had been a delay. Escape had been an illusion. He no longer blamed himself for seeking relief, nor blamed the women for offering what they could. They were all participants in a structure that valued appearances over truth, ritual over emotion, legacy over humanity. Their roles were shaped by the same forces that shaped his crown: tradition, power, and exhaustion. In the end, he confronted a truth heavier than any ceremonial robe. Escape did not exist for a man whose life was fused to duty. His attempts to flee had never been steps toward liberation. They had been circles. Circles that returned him, always to the center of his own confinement. The longing remained, not for affection or novelty, but for rest, a kind of rest that could not be found in another person's arms, nor in a hidden room, nor in a moment stolen from responsibility. It was a rest that belonged to lives untouched by crowns, and he understood, finally, that such rest would never be his. As he stood in the dimness of the palace, surrounded by silence that felt almost tender, he recognized that the escape he had sought for years had been nothing more than a shadow painted onto a wall. His hand had reached for it countless times, only to touch stone. What remained was not bitterness, nor regret, but a quiet acceptance, an acceptance that his life, in all its weight and ceremony, offered no paths outward, only paths inward. Illusions dissolved slowly, leaving him face to face with a truth he could no longer turn from. Somewhere within that heavy clarity, he sensed that every step he had taken had been a circle, seeking an exit that never existed. Dim traces suggested that acceptance, not escape, was the final thing he had yet to learn. And now, as the halls grow still and the night gathers softly, may your own rest find you without burdens. May your breathing ease, your thoughts quiet, and your sleep come gently. Good night, and may peace settle more kindly upon you than it ever did upon a king.